The race is on, and Max Verstappen appears to be going nowhere for next year. So does that mean we can close this latest chapter of his potential move to Mercedes? And does a new one simply start for 2027? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to answer those questions and look ahead to the Hungarian Grand Prix are Scott Mitchell-Malm and Josh Suttill. Well, Scott, we'll come to you first. We're in your room in our Budapest hotel. You're on a cushion because you've got the low chair. How are you feeling about life?
Slightly better since we manufactured the cushion when we were doing a couple of test recordings. Obviously, this isn't great for the people that are listening to this purely through audio only, but for those watching, I was lacking a much needed little bit of height. I felt very much out of place between the two of you, giants that you are in the podcasting world, but also physically giants around me. But yeah, feeling good. We've managed to create a little bit of a pod and video recording space in our room in the Ibis Hotel just by Hero Square. It's our usual place that we stay when we come to Hungary now. Really cool, just sort of on the edge of the city, circuit side of the city. This is always quite a fun place to come, isn't it?
Yeah, Budapest, great. Is this your first time to Budapest, Josh?
Second time.
Second.
Yes, I am, again, sorry, audio listeners. Last time I was that way, about 10 minutes, and this time about that way, 10 minutes.
You could just use actual directions rather than point.
Oh, yeah, true. Unfortunately, it's just one big road, so it's actually very, very hard to get lost.
You're about 3 blocks sort of northwest of us, aren't you?
Yes, which will mean nothing to some people.
Slightly better than pointing.
And your
Yes.
current orientation, you're currently to the left. That's where you're staying, whereas last time it's to the right.
Correct.
Excellent. Well, now we've got everybody's bearings sorted out, we can get on with talking about the driver market. Now, Josh, you're Josh.
This is because when we were doing the test recordings, everything, Josh was sat in my seat.
This is what happens, yeah. Well, Scott was doing the expert setup work, which was important to be done.
This is actually going out in video form because I've screwed it up so much. The first 2 minutes of so-called banter is not going to make any sense.
Exactly, yeah. Well, I think people sort of see
The audience can be the judge of that as well, I think, if you set it up well.
They'll see the setup we've got. But anyway, Scott, Max Verstappen looks like he's staying at Red Bull Racing now. So does that mean the driver market's going to stay settled? There's not going to be this huge grenade thrown in that will create all sorts of knock-on effects, and that Russell and Antonelli will stay at Mercedes?
It does look that way. I don't think we're going to get a Lewis Hamilton Ferrari-style shock now. But I have been wrong about the driver market while in Hungary before. It was quite literally in this hotel where I made my famous Fernando Alonso faux pas during that Alpine Aston Martin shock a few summers ago. But basically, this is obviously going to sound a lot like, okay, so we've spent the last few months talking about something that was never going to happen, and it hasn't happened. And I completely understand that. But obviously, Mercedes were scoping out Max's availability. There was an exit clause in play, but what has changed is that exit clause is now irrelevant. As we understand it, Max needed to be in the top 3 in the Drivers' Championship by the summer break. I think the actual date is somewhere in August. There will be a specific date for it, but it's late enough. It basically covers the summer break, and that is guaranteed now. So he had to be in the top 3 in the championship to stay at Red Bull for that exit clause not to be in effect. That's going to happen. I think he's 28 points ahead of George Russell, ironically the person whose seat he might have taken, and there's only 25 points up for grabs in Hungary, even if they had the once brilliant bonus point for fastest lap, as you often said that F1 deserved to have, it wouldn't have been enough. So yeah, the shift as we understand it right now, and I think this is, I wouldn't be surprised if someone like Helmut Marko confirms this, because he just refuses to be tight-lipped even when he's meant to be. Max is going nowhere. So that specific part of this driver market story is over, but you alluded to it in the intro. The rest is probably only just beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. But you have to say, Josh, this seems like a quite good outcome for Verstappen, because while there's high hopes for Mercedes for next year, there's still question marks over the ability to produce a chassis that can do the job, because they'd still have to beat, say, McLaren, even if they do have the best power unit. So is this not actually strategically quite good for Max Verstappen? See how next year starts, and then pretty much anyone will move mountains to sign Verstappen. So he should have a choice of wherever he wants for 27.
Yeah, precisely. I think it's the best option, really, to stay at Red Bull. Take that 1 year, see how the competitive order plays out, and then go to whoever's got the best car and say, look, I want to drive for you, or whoever he sees having the best car in 27, 28. So I think it's worked out well for him. It's obviously worked out for Red Bull very well. Laurent Mekies has got immediately a bit of an immediate win there to know that he's got Max Obviously, as we've alluded to, it's not safe for 27, so it's not like he can sit back and go, okay, I've got Max, locked down now. There's still got to be important work done there, but it will at least give, a little bit of breathing space there, that at least these immediate questions of Max's future will be settled. And it's also, of course, good news for someone else, isn't it? It's good news for George Russell, Scott, who probably will be feeling quite good that the person most likely to replace him is staying where he is for next year.
I think it'll just hurry things along now because there isn't anything obvious blocking Russell and Mercedes doing that deal. Although, based on how the last few races have gone, I don't really think the idea of Russell and Verstappen together would have been particularly productive for Mercedes. It would have been excellent for us. It would have been great box office. It would have been a points machine. But with the way that Kimi Antonelli's been struggling, there's started to be some whispers about whether he could be the driver that made way, whether it would be sensible to take him out of the firing line at Mercedes and park him somewhere else. But just to come back to what you were discussing initially about the fact that this sort of makes things easier for Mick, I think it's also just logical for Verstappen. Just because that potential exit was in play, we had been saying for a while that we still thought he would stay at Red Bull for 2026 anyway. So it's not a massive surprise. We should also say, just because the exit clause is going to expire or whatever the exact terminology you should use around that is, he could still leave. Like, if he wanted to, if he had a massive falling out of everybody at Red Bull and it was in everybody's interest, they'd just buy himself out of his contract or something. Like, there would still be a mechanism for him to go if he wanted to. But I've always had the feeling that Max only really needed Red Bull to give him a reason to stay. Because I think he is loyal to Red Bull. I think he does love the idea of staying there long term. Maybe he hasn't seen enough signs of progress this year to really sway him, but I feel like there's just so much of a question mark on 2026. All the while he has the luxury of waiting and then having his pick of the best team. It made total sense to just ride it out and accept that 2026 might be a bit of a disappointment, but it would then basically give him complete freedom to unlock the best possible future.
And I think when it became clear Verstappen wasn't going to Mercedes for this year, the rumours for the following year started almost immediately. I think it will be a while before these fire up again, because it makes sense just to wait. And we're not going to see the cars running on track until late January, the first test. That's going to be the first proper indication of the relative competitive order. So this will, I think, all calm down now. But I have to say, Russell's been quite an interesting case, because he spoke on Thursday, wherever we were last week, Spa, and he was quite interesting, because he seemed to sort of indicate there was maybe a point a few months ago where he was a little bit worried. And then he said, well, I made a kind of conscious decision to focus on the controllables, just keep delivering. And he has done that. He's performed well. And you'd have to say, Josh, that if Russell had been elbowed out by Verstappen coming in, which you could understand any team would want Verstappen, it would have been... I'm wary about using the word unfair, because this is Formula One, and if you're not the absolute best driver on the grid performing the absolute best, even if you're only the second best driver on the grid, you could make a case. Russell's been that this year. You're always vulnerable to something like that. But it would have been harsh, wouldn't it, if he'd been elbowed out?
I'm fine to use that it would be unfair. I think it's deserved that Russell stays in a top team next year. It would have been unjust if he hadn't. Obviously, maybe he'd have moved across to Red Bull, but even so, I think he deserves to stay where he is. You look at the top performers this year, like you say, there's Max Verstappen, and that race for second, you've maybe got Charles Leclerc, Oscar Piastri, but I'd put Russell right up there as well, and he's probably my pick for the second best driver this year. So it would have been horrible if he'd have been moved out. And this is this kind of thing is always difficult, but I can't help but feel if you put the way Russell's performing this year, if you put him in the McLaren this year, I'd even suspect that he'd do an even better job than what Piastri and Norris are doing. I think he'd possibly be leading the championship there, because he's kind of got the raw speed to match Norris, and then he's kind of got the small error rate that Piastri has. He's almost the best of both, and is maybe evenly marginally quicker. Like I say, an incredible hypothetical that's always hard to judge, but that's kind of a testament to the level he's performing at this year.
I think it's the growth that we've seen from Russell in terms of the error rate. Josh mentioned it just there. We've seen in previous years that Russell, the pace was no question, and his peak performances in races was not a question, but there were too many sort of unforced errors. I think sometimes he's guilty of chasing a result that maybe wasn't there or whatever, and it was often justified as, not here to finish third, fourth, fifth. So if there's if we can roll the dice and try and grab a win, that's what I want to do. But I think he's moved out of that mindset a little bit. It's been a bit tricky the last few races. Mercedes has struggled since it coincides at the moment with the flexi wing clampdown at the Spanish Grand Prix in June. But they are talking openly within the team that might have been where they've taken a wrong direction and lost a bit of balance with the car. And the way the car is now does make it a little bit easier to make errors again. So you always have the question, look at the McLaren drivers. Look at Alex Albon, for example, has talked a lot about this. Albon doesn't think he's driving any better this year than last year, but he thinks he has a car that's easier to take to the limit. So he's not making as many mistakes as last year. He's executing cleaner races. So there could be an element of that with Russell when the Mercedes, because that was the Mercs' big weapon in the first sort of half a dozen, 7 races or so. It was very consistent. It seemed a very usable car, certainly in the early sort of phase of the season. All that said, I do think Russell has sharpened up this year. I think he's performing at a very high level. I think that 1 lap pace hasn't disappeared, so that's as strong as ever. He's been incredibly dependable, and I agree that it would be harsh if he then got either shuffled out entirely or in a situation where he would, whatever way it played out, basically played second fiddle to Verstappen, because he would know that Mercedes has moved a lot to try and accommodate Verstappen. He would know that he would know what Verstappen's like and how he's likely to operate and what that sort of camp around him is and how ruthless it can all be. And it would have mirrored a very unfortunate kind of theme of his Mercedes career, which is when he got his hands on the best ever Mercedes in 2020, he should have won on his debut, and various circumstances went against him in that race to ensure that he didn't. When he then got the full-time move, even before that, when he was ready to make the full-time move and Mercedes wanted him, he was locked in at a Williams contract in 2021, so he couldn't move then. When he then got the full-time move, Mercedes fell off its perch. It was no longer the dominant team, and he's had little moments in the sun since then, but nothing like he would have expected. So if rumours are to be believed, and Mercedes is going to be at the front at the start of the new rules in 2026, it would have been unfair, it would have been harsh, and it would have been in keeping with this slight, right place, wrong time, or even sometimes wrong place, wrong time that Russell's had for the last few years.
And in a way, it's better for Mercedes because they've invested a huge amount in George Russell. They've grown their own in him, you could say, and to bin him off at a point where he might just be ready to go for a championship in terms of having the machinery. I've no doubt he is ready to go for a championship as a driver. He just doesn't have the car. That would have been unfortunate, to say the least. But Josh, what about Kimi Antonelli? Chances are they're both going to be there next year, but he's having this really tough time at the moment. So it wouldn't be a good look if they farmed him off somewhere, would it?
To Alpine, that would be probably the kind of worst case scenario, right? That's the problem. I feel like they've
Why?
made...
What's wrong with Alpine?
Well, put a young driver in there. It's it's not going to be good. If you want to take some of the pressure off, I don't think that's the right destination. Somewhere like Williams, of course, would have been great, but that has got to be from the start. I don't think you can kind of retroactively then go, okay, we were wrong, we need to put him in a midfield team. I think Mercedes has to back him as they have from the start. I think they were still right to. I've seen a lot of people using this as evidence of, they never should have put Antonelli in the main team. It was clear from day one that he never should have been there. But actually, you look at the start to his season, and it was very solid. He started on the right trajectory. Mercedes was proved correct at the start, and then it all just went very, very badly wrong. And I don't feel like you can just say, well, clearly they shouldn't have put him in that car. They should have put Carlos Sainz in. But look at Carlos Sainz's season. It hasn't been perfect to Williams. There's still been a lot of growing pains. He'd have probably scored more points than Antonelli, but that doesn't make Antonelli's move a failure at the moment. It's difficult though to see where they go from here. He's in a big rut. I think the results probably look worse than they actually are, because the last 7 rounds, I think there's only been that podium in Montreal as his only score. Clearly, he's not performing that badly. A couple of kind of small things have gone very badly and hugely wrong. There was the steering wheel setting in Austria, I think, that caused the slam into Max Verstappen. Obviously, Isaac Hadjar hit him at Silverstone in the feature race. In the feature race, we're not in F2 anymore. In the Grand Prix. So there's
tell where your priorities lie.
Yeah, exactly. You can see these little things have added up to quite big, obviously, no scores and a real lack of confidence. I mean, he sounded and looked over that Spa weekend really in a proper crisis of confidence. I don't think he can fix it suddenly for this weekend, but I'm sure over the summer break there's going to be a lot of conversations with Mercedes, and he's going to need a big reset for the second half of the year.
James Allison, the Mercedes technical director, said technical director, said that both Antonelli and the team are pretty fed up with this situation that they're in, and not in a critical way about Kimi specifically, but just fed up in terms of the expectations they had and the results they expected at the start of the season obviously haven't materialised overall, and especially in recent races. The high points, like his qualifying performances in the Miami Sprint where he got pole, and then also for the Grand Prix proper, his podium that Josh mentioned in Montreal. The peaks have been there; they just haven't happened quite as often as we would have expected, and the floor's been very low as well, which I think is what has surprised Antonelli and surprised Mercedes. I think we've just had a very extreme version of what we could have had, or probably thought might be the worst case scenario. It's worse than we expected, but it's just at the extreme end of what you get when you put an 18-year-old in an F1 car when he's had one season in Formula 2. They knew they were taking a gamble. When you do that and you accept that there will be highs and lows through that first season, and you need to stick with your driver through those low points, it would make no sense for them to get rid of him. And we should say there hasn't been any serious indication from Mercedes that they want to do that. They're offering full support to Kimi. I think they've gone about handling him quite well. I think they recognise that they got things wrong previously, the way they talked about him, the way putting him in the car for FP1 for the first time at Monza last year, that kind of stuff. But this year they have really tried to do the right thing. And if they did put him somewhere else, I think that would be an acknowledgement that they've already done damage that they need to correct. And if they're in that situation, it would be quite hard, I think, for him to come back from it. So I hope and I expect he will just continue with Mercedes, and they will just keep working to find a solution. The main thing at the moment is Antonelli needs to be able to drive the Mercedes his way, which he can't do because I think he's actually having a little bit of a Lewis Hamilton style situation there, where I think his driving styles, it's instigating a few problems that the Mercedes is prone to, and Russell's sort of working around them a bit. So if they can try and get that under control, you never know. We might see quite a sharp leap forward quite quickly.
Yeah, it's logical for them to back him, isn't it? You don't put him in and accept it's going to be difficult at times and then swerve away from him. I think they've got to say, right, we're going to back you. It's not like 20 years ago when you could give him a year of intensive testing or something, which you could justify doing that. So yeah, you've gone with Antonelli. I think it makes sense to stick with him. Right, Josh, let's move ahead to the Hungarian Grand Prix now. What are you expecting from this weekend in terms of storylines, the impact on the Drivers' Championship battle at the front?
I suspect there'll be a lot of questions for Max Verstappen on Thursday, once again, about his future, now saying it's secured. Again, I don't think we'll get many answers, and that's completely fair. But hopefully for him, at least, that noise will quiet down after the summer break. On track, you'd expect McLaren to be the quickest. It's quite hard to believe this is Oscar Piastri's first win just this time last year in F1, which is mind-bogglingly because he's moved on so much since then. Last year, you could say Norris potentially had the edge of pace. Obviously, remember there was the whole team orders thing. And Norris says this is one of his favourite tracks, likes it a lot more than Spa, always gets on with it, had his first test here in Formula 1 as well. There's a lot of history here. It's kind of Groundhog Day, isn't it, with the McLaren drivers and previewing a weekend, because it's so easy to say, okay, Piastri's got the momentum, Norris has to hit back this weekend. But really, it's kind of one weekend isn't going to make a huge amount of difference, is it? I think that the most important thing for Norris is to win. The most important thing for Piastri is to win. So, in terms of the competition, are we expecting much competition from Ferrari, Red Bull this weekend, Mercedes? Could they be a bit more back in the mix?
I'm inclined to think with the speed range we've got of corners here. Hungaroring's it's seen as a slow circuit, but it's more into the medium speed range with these cars now. It's McLaren territory, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and we saw that last year. We saw how much McLaren flexed its muscles, and that was, if you remember, 12 months ago is when Red Bull brought quite a big upgrade to the car, had a lot of expectations from it. It's one of the reasons why Verstappen was so upset during the race. They didn't handle the Grand Prix very well either strategically, but they brought something to the car that they thought would be a good step forward. But one, it didn't work as well as they hoped it would, but also they think they saw the full might of the McLaren and a glimpse of what we've seen more regularly this year. So it doesn't look like it's going to be quite as absolutely roasting hot as we've had at the Hungaroring in the past, but it's still going to be warm. It's still going to be at the high 20s, I think, in air temperature. Track temperature is going to be very, very hot because it'll sit there in the baking sun all day long. There's a little bit of maybe a threat of some rain. There's a bit of cloud around. Yesterday, for example, when we arrived and we were walking out, we were observing, weren't we, as we came out of the airport. This is the sort of coldest I can remember it being in Hungary. So never rule it out. But if it is a dry weekend, I think it'll be McLaren that have the edge, and then it'll be basically the other 2 or 3 teams falling over each other trying to be second best. I think the way it's gone of late, it would be a struggle for Mercedes to nip in there, but there's a little bit of a speed range, a little bit less of a speed range compromise, isn't there, for this track? So maybe that will help them. And obviously will get another look at the new Ferrari suspension on a different kind of circuit, slightly more conventional circuit than Spa. So who knows? But I imagine it will be a very close fight for second, but it will be a fight for second.
Well, Ferrari's expecting more from their upgrades, aren't they? So let's see if they deliver more and Red Bull's upgrade.
Well, Leclerc didn't want to say too much, did he? Said he would rather wait and hit the track before I think the phrase he used was leave himself exposed. He was very much in play it all down mode, wasn't he, in Belgium?
Yeah, but also quietly confident about it. He was talking after qualifying about the fact that qualifying has been his weak point so far this year. He said that very strongly.
Famously bad qualifier, Charles.
Well, exactly. Well, he kept saying, look, qualifying is normally a strong suit for me, and it's not been great this year. I did a piece for the race website, and I looked back over the year, and his qualifying hadn't been bad, but there were just no Leclerc specials going on. And then we get to Spa, you have the upgrade. He out-qualified Verstappen, which even though Verstappen was on the higher downforce configuration, probably shouldn't have done. So Leclerc was pretty close to the maximum of the car. So I think he's quietly happy with it. But this will be a better test of how much of a gain it is. I'm not saying Ferrari's going to be winning, but it's a chance to see exactly how much progress they've made. And then, of course, we're going to have the midfield battle, which
should be interesting because Williams obviously was a midfield leader in Spa, but they have a really bad record around here. So it's quite going to be interesting to see, is the improved Williams still the class in the midfield here, or is it going to be somebody else?
I genuinely think you could just take a classic roll of the dice basically, and then say, right, whichever side comes up, that'll be the midfield team that's in Q3 for this weekend. Because as we've seen, even Alpine, which is last in the championship and ostensibly the worst team, it's not got the slowest car, and especially in Pierre Gasly's hands, it doesn't have the slowest car. So you come to a track like this where it shifts again, such a different circuit profile to Spa. What we saw last weekend, where Williams hit the front of it again, but I think Komatsu said that Haas felt they had the 5th fastest car at Spa, and it's been 2 race weekends in a row now where they haven't really maximised that since their upgrade at Silverstone. I don't know what the midfield will bring. That is much harder to guess than the Ferrari, Red Bull, Mercedes fight.
It's worth noting on the midfield, I've seen a couple of times among the Race Members Club questioning why we call it the midfield battle, because it goes down to the back, doesn't it? But it is the midfield battle because any of those 6 teams can get to the front of it. We've seen, Williams was at the front of it in the race at Spa, Haas in the sprint race, Sauber was at the front of it at Silverstone, but it could have been Alpine because Gasly was right up there as well.
Aston was up there for a bit, wasn't it?
Exactly. So any of those 6 teams can pop up at the front. Racing Bulls has consistently been sort of towards the front. In fact, I think they've been at the front more than others, certainly in terms of qualifying performance.
Liam Lawson was 6th in Austria.
Exactly, yeah. So it's a battle insofar as, yes, it's true, whoever's at the back of that battle in the midfield on any weekend, as Aston was at Belgium, will be at the back. It's still a midfield battle because you're only a race or 2 away from them being at the front of it.
It's the fight to be at the front of the midfield, isn't it?
Exactly, and it's really, really fascinating. It's often been the way in the past decade or so in Formula 1 that you said, wow, if that was the battle at the front, it would be a wonderfully topsy-turvy fight for Grand Prix victories and championships. But it's a fascinating subplot, and obviously everyone wants to set themselves up for a nice, relaxed August break. In the final section of the podcast, we're going to turn over the questions to the Race Members Club. As always, we get loads of questions after each Grand Prix, and we've got a little batch we'll take on here. And of course, in the Race Members Club, you don't just get to ask questions on this podcast, you get all sorts of bonus content. And that includes the recent discussion I did with Glenn Freeman and Ben Anderson about the Hill documentary, which is titled imaginatively Hill. but it's a very good title, very good documentary as well. So we thought it's worth us having a watch, making lots and lots of notes about it, and have a bit of a chat about what we learned from it. And I would certainly recommend anybody who is interested, not just in Damon Hill, but in Formula One drivers generally. It's a fascinating insight, really well put together. Simon Lazenby of Sky, actually, his production company was involved in it, and Damon Hill's interviewed extensively. His wife Georgie as well is a key player in that. Really, really worth a watch. Now, to give everybody a taste of what that's about, at the end of this podcast, we're going to run a clip. So after I've done the outro and said goodbye, you'll be able to have a bit of a listen to that, and that'll tell you a little bit about what you get from the Race Members Club. But we're going to get into the questions now, which I have here neatly arranged on my iPhone, and the first one is going to go to you, Scott, from Ed R Gaming. I'm sending this before watching the race. Well, the race has long since gone, but it's still pertinent. But is Franco Colapinto now only in his seat due to his funding? His pace seems a clear step from Gasly, now when at least Jack Doohan had flashes of some pace.
There's a bit of that, but I do think Colapinto in recent races has started to look a bit more promising. It hasn't always played out exactly as he or Alpine would have wanted. But you go back, Alpine were quite happy with the fact that he has turned a corner in terms of the sort of peak pace he's now capable of showing. He's sort of moved away from being absolutely in no man's land through practice and then needing to find a second or so just to look to have a chance of getting into Q2 or anything like that. It's still had a couple where he's been a bit too far off, but there's been a little bit of a step there. So he's starting weekends a little bit better. But there's also just been, generally speaking, you've been a little bit closer to that kind of average gap that Doohan had. So you're looking at around 2 or 3 attempts to Gasly, which may still not be enough. Gasly's not necessarily an absolute A-list driver, but we know that when he's at his very best, he's fantastic in the midfield. So maybe within a couple of attempts of him is actually respectable. I think what's a bigger problem than actually the pace at the moment, because I think he was only a couple of attempts off at Spa. Silverstone before that, he was actually putting together a good weekend until very, very regrettable and unnecessary spin and that ended his qualifying early. And it's those errors that he needs to cut out, because the gaps have been becoming more respectable. The second half of this Alpine stint's going a little bit more like we saw him versus Alex Albon in the second half of his Williams stint last year. So still not quite at that peak of this is a guy that looks like he's really going to go out and challenge for points. But I think he's kind of getting there, and yes, the backing helps, and some of it might not be completely obvious in terms of a bunch of new sponsors or anything like that. But Alpine, there are financial benefits to having Colapinto in the car, sometimes just in a more roundabout way. But I think they know that having jettisoned Doohan, they kind of need to make Colapinto work, and I think that, as well as the funding, is what's going to buy him a bit more time.
The problem is just the results, isn't it? Because I said to Franco after the race, I said this weekend, it hasn't been as bad as it looks maybe. The gap hasn't been too big. And he kind of looked at me and went, well, I need to improve. Because there was 0 points there. They got rid of Jack Doohan because the second car wasn't scoring any points, and Colapinto has taken over and not scored any points, and that's the biggest problem. And like you say, it's a shame. I really wish that Silverstone weekend would have played out properly without the spin, because I feel like that could have been the start of something, and even, like I say, Spa wasn't too bad. Let's see if he can do it this weekend, at least with 3 practice sessions.
Yeah, he does need the result. That's the big thing. He's been brought in to score points and hasn't scored points, and he knows that. It's just, I can't emphasise enough how much of an almost impossible position he and Doohan before him were put in. And we talked early in the first part of this podcast about Antonelli and Mercedes, and one of the big narratives around Antonelli at the moment is sort of, how fair do you need to be to him? Do you need to give him a bit of a break? Is there a bit of a pile-on for someone that young? Yes, and that applied to Doohan and it applies to Colapinto, but it's an elite sporting arena, and that is one of the reasons why judgment can be so harsh. The thing that makes that even kind of more unfair in the Alpine driver situation is they've been put in positions where they're basically being set up to fail by Flavio Briatore, effectively. And that's why I do have a bit of sympathy, and it might sound like I'm being a bit more defensive of them, just because I can't just eliminate that circumstance. I do think that's a big factor in what's going on.
And it certainly makes no sense for them to chop and change drivers endlessly. You've got to pick your lane and stay in it effectively when it comes to your...
Pick a driver.
Exactly. Right, the next question, Josh, for you from Grant Carroll. As a Kiwi, I'm following Liam Lawson with interest. Another solid points finish at Spa. Do you think he's doing enough to retain his seat?
More chopping and changing of seats. Liam Lawson's future is entirely dependent on Yuki Tsunoda, more or less, because if Yuki Tsunoda performs well enough in that second Red Bull, if that improvement we saw in Spa is validated this weekend after the summer break, then Red Bull will probably keep him. If that breakthrough is, not sustained, obviously they're probably going to make a swap probably for next year. Who's the most logical candidate? Isaac Hadjar. So then Isaac Hadjar will move up into the senior team, and that will leave 2 spaces then in Racing Bulls. We'd expect Arvid Lindblad will get one of those seats. So Lindblad's in one of the seats, there's one more. Then that logically can go to Lawson, especially because he's had this great turnaround. On the evidence of those 2 races with Red Bull, you'd say he's got no future in F1. Even the first few races back in the Racing Bulls was a bit mixed. Certainly the results weren't there, even if the potential was. But he has delivered on that potential since, and I think made himself a good candidate for there. But like I say, the problem is if Tsunoda does a good enough job and stays in the senior team, then suddenly you've got a scenario where Hadjar will probably stay at Racing Bulls, and Red Bull will probably want to give Lindblad a seat in F1, and the most logical seat will be the seat occupied by Lawson. Red Bull knows that Lawson is probably not a future Red Bull racing driver again, because I think we've never seen that before, where a driver has been dropped from the main team and then found their way back there. That's why his future is dependent on Tsunoda, and that's quite a difficult position to be in, because he could have a pretty solid season, and I think really the only way to secure his future is if he absolutely clears above Hadjar, but that will probably say more about Hadjar than it will about Lawson.
I'm not 100% convinced Red Bull will put Lindblad in either way, regardless of what happens over the rest of the year. I think Lindblad's doing a very good job in Formula 2, and F2 is very difficult, as you well know, Josh, to get an accurate read on drivers the last few years. But if their ideal scenario, sort of the hardest position they'll be in, will be that Tsunoda gets it together and is doing a really good job at Red Bull, and that Lawson and Hadjar are both performing well at Racing Bulls. And then if Lindblad's really, really knocking on the door of an F1 promotion, they'll have a hard decision to make. And in that scenario, it is probably Lawson that goes. But I don't know. I'm not convinced it's a done thing that the lineups will change. Maybe it's a small possibility, but I think there is a possibility that actually the lineups that we have now continue into next season for a bit of stability. It kind of depends who will have the decision-making power in this post-Christian Horner era. I suspect that Helmut Marko has reclaimed a little bit of land there in terms of making driver decisions. I don't know where Mekies will fit in, but we know that Mekies is someone who has spoken very highly of both Lawson and Tsunoda in the past, and he strikes me as the kind of person who'd like to give people as much time as possible. Maybe they've kind of learned their lessons the hard way and feel that, dumping Lindblad in straight away after 1 year in F2 might not be in his best interest. I don't know. The lie of the land is different post-Horner, so that's kind of hard to judge. But I think Lawson's given himself a fighting chance, and that definitely wasn't the case a few races ago. Yeah,
he's certainly delivering at a good, consistent level. I guess the big problem is that 10 years ago, you might have said to Lindblad, okay, you've had your learning year in F2, now go in and dominate it. I always remember when Grosjean was brought back by Gravity, who were associated with Lotus, Eric Bouillet, who was running that scheme, and the team basically said to Grosjean, not only do you have to win this championship, you've got to be the boss of it. But that sort of thing doesn't happen anymore. Partly that's because F2 seems to be quite a capricious place to be racing, in that you don't necessarily know whether your team's going to be up to it the following year, so that could play a part. But I'd say on Lawson, he's doing a very good job now. The recent races, I think if you're making it purely on who's going to get you the most points next year for Racing Bulls, you might well stick with Lawson. Next up, a question that I'll take from Russ Taylor. Does Charles Leclerc get the plaudits he deserves? Charles did a super job at Spa, controlling his tyre wear, yet keeping a challenging Max behind him for 40 laps at Spa. Yeah, it's always difficult because it depends what plaudits you're talking about and from who.
Where was he in your rank?
He was number one. So,
well, there you go.
Yeah, he does. He does that. There's your answer. Yes, he does. But I think we're just used to Leclerc being at a very, very high level, aren't we? And he's in a slightly awkward position in that he's shown everything he possibly can until he gets into a title fight. So he's just driving around being Charles Leclerc. Obviously, this year's been a bit more patchy because of the car limitations, but he's still done a pretty good job, Silverstone aside, which was a bit of a nightmare for him. But he's just almost part of the furniture at that level in a Ferrari that's not quite there at the moment. So maybe he doesn't get as much applause, but I think he's recognised by his peers and people on the outside, or a lot of fans, as someone who's right up there in terms of quality. So perhaps it's not as in your face every day of the week how good Leclerc is, but there comes a point where you can say 1,000 times, well, he's brilliant, he's ready to fight for a championship, let's see how he does. And while you're waiting for that to happen, it's just nothing changes. He's very, very, very good, outstandingly good.
Well, I think that's the problem. I think Leclerc has had pretty much from the start with Ferrari. The reality is his seasons have been the case where he's had very good weekends that go unnoticed and go under the radar because it's a run to third, or he's done well and overachieved and got into the top 5 in 2020 and 2021 for example. So I do think there's a little bit about that, but that's just that reflects the fact that he has spent 6-7 years now treading water in a car that can fight for wins but not a championship, and sometimes like this year can't even fight for wins. So it is unfortunate. It means that he has to do something truly extraordinary sometimes, depending on the circumstances, to get noticed more widely. But within F1, driver rankings as an example, I do think there has been quite consistently recognition for just how good a job Leclerc's doing. What's perhaps unfortunate for him, and I don't know if there's much more he can do about this, is until he gets into a car that can be consistent over a season at the very, very front and fight for a championship, there'll always be a question mark over him. It's like, okay, yeah, he's great, but can he do it over a full season? And that's not really been in his control, but it is definitely something that you hear sometimes. I think like Marco, for example, when he's talked about Verstappen rivals, has made that comment about Leclerc. So that would be like the sort of one asterisk that there is really against him.
And even the question marks over his wet prowess. He's had a difficult time often in the wet at Ferrari, but he was talking about that recently. He says, well, I'm good in the wet. It's just that Ferrari, we've not been good in the wet for quite a long time, and we need to do something better with that. So, there's a chance for him to prove his worth once he's in a regular...
I can't think of another, a driver like that who's had to wait so long for a championship-winning car, a championship, contending car. Like, I had a quick think in my head now from this century, and no name comes to mind.
Daniel Ricciardo, but of course it never came.
Yeah, but I'd put Leclerc probably in an even bigger tier than that. But yeah, that's a good example.
Right, the next question that we'll throw at you, Scott. How has McLaren pulled away from the other teams? They look even more dominant since the technical directive.
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. The timing of that's quite funny because obviously McLaren said all along that there really wouldn't be anything there. So there's maybe a little bit of, we talked about Mercedes earlier on, for example, where maybe they've taken a bit of a backward step. We know that Ferrari's been waiting for the combination of the floor, which came a few races ago, and then the rear suspension, which came in Belgium, and then there's a period of optimising that. And Red Bull's just been in this kind of on-off phase of trying to bring as many updates as possible. Some of them have worked as well as hoped. Some of them have worked, but maybe needed a little bit more. But McLaren has been relentlessly developing its car as well. It's sort of really good this year at sort of every couple of races, bringing something. And there's also stuff where it's like it brings something, it tests it on the Friday, it goes away for a couple of races, then it comes back. They don't really run stuff on their car unless it works. And when it works, it delivers a really, really sharp little gain. They have two drivers who are driving at their respective peaks, I think. There's been a lot made of Norris's mistakes, but I think Lando's still driving better than he's done in his career because he's in a new position and he's proving very, very fast. So I just think that there's... Basically, McLaren right now looks like it's absolutely the sum of all its parts. Just feels like everything's pretty much firing at the moment, whereas all the other teams, there's little things missing, right? Like Red Bull seem to be on a better trajectory now, but they're coming from a lower base, so it's going to be harder for them to catch up. Ferrari has been figuring out some inherent limitations for a few months, so there's that. Mercedes has made a backward step, so has clearly got something wrong. McLaren's not doing that. It's not leaving anything on the table. So all the while it does that, but also raises the bar a little higher as well. Those other teams have to keep going with them, and like maybe sometimes they are, but they're also missing something every now and again. And also the situation will change track to track, because there will be some circuits where the McLaren advantage genuinely only is half a tenth or a tenth, but there's others where in certain circumstances, on certain corners, certain situations, whether it's qualifying or the race, the advantage could be upwards of half a second. So that is something that needs to be judged sort of over the balance of a season rather than just individual race to race, because you'll just get trapped in and tricked by the swings that come just by going circuit to circuit.
Thank goodness there's a rule change next year, because really look at the rivals and think any of them are actually going to catch McLaren anytime soon.
But they should be strong in 26 as well, McLaren. And obviously the thing that's really stood out about them is their race pace because of that tyre management. So even when it's a little bit tighter in qualifying, they're just in a different level. And I think if you look at all the races they've not won this year, Suzuka had the quicker car, should have won. Imola, if Piastri had held the lead at the start, should have been a McLaren win. And Canada, if that wasn't cold, short corner circuit, Russell wouldn't have been as strong as he was, and if McLaren had maximised what they could do, which they didn't on that weekend, they'd have been very close to winning as well. So we're actually not far off McLaren winning every single race this season kind of scenario. Right, Josh, a question from Davy Coolan. Much has been made during the Belgian Grand Prix weekend of the documents Lewis Hamilton said he handed over to Ferrari in a quest to improve both their car and operations. This begs the question, don't all top drivers do this in some form or another, either through meetings or via the written word? How valuable is this driver feedback to a top team that should have a grasp of its strengths and weaknesses, regardless of what its drivers are telling it, as it already employs intelligent and experienced personnel across the board to help it improve? What can he tell them that they don't already know? And why do you think has Lewis decided to make this internal discussion at Ferrari public?
Yeah, all top drivers do this. You look at his predecessors at Ferrari, Fernando Alonso, Sebastian Vettel, Michael Schumacher. They'd have all brought massive amounts of knowledge from other teams, from championship-winning teams, and that's the value that Lewis can bring. He knows how Mercedes became this behemoth of dominating Formula One, and there is bits of knowledge there that he can bring that Ferrari won't know. Obviously, there are quite a couple of ex-Mercedes people within Ferrari, so there'll already be some knowledge of the working processes there. But yeah, there is an immense amount of value that a seven-time world champion can bring to a team. Even if the performance hasn't been there on track, you can no doubt there will be things that Hamilton has brought to Ferrari that has really improved that team. It's right down to everything, just from arriving into the weekend, how you prepare a weekend, the operational process throughout, strategy, car setup. There are a million different things of how an F1 team works, and I'm sure he's brought dozens and dozens of things there. So they'll be very useful to Ferrari. Why he's made it public, I'm not sure. It's just his choice. I think, am I right in thinking that the engineer change that's been made, I think that Hamilton just mentioned that off the cuff on an interview on Sunday. It's kind of like that. It's kind of it's up to Hamilton really what he wants to make public.
Well, I think there's probably two or three aspects to it. One is sometimes he's just asked, and then he'll just give an honest answer. So he'll be asked, what are you doing behind the scenes to try and change things at Ferrari?
Which I think he was. I think that's how this came up. He said, someone asked, what have you been doing in the gap? And that's what he'd been doing in the gap.
Exactly. He'd been at Maranello, he'd had meetings, and so he talked about that. So that's not just him going around saying, well, I'm just going to show I'm amazing and working super hard and look at my work ethic. The second factor is there will be a little bit of that. Like that's not unfair to say, especially in the situation that Lewis is in, where he doesn't have like big headline results so far this year because of the situation Ferrari's in. But Leclerc now has 5 podiums, I think, in Grand Prix, and Hamilton has the sprint win, but he doesn't have a Grand Prix podium. And I think he's
third, isn't he?
Yeah, he's third on the list now of drivers who like number of races to take your first podium for Ferrari, and obviously he'll keep climbing that list until he gets one. So there's a little bit there of being like, look, I know I don't have something sort of totemic to show for this, but there's this. Look at all this other stuff that we're doing in the background and working on. So there'll be a little bit of him wanting to make sure that kind of stuff is known. And then I think the other factor is just simply like character. I think that's just what Lewis is like. He's always quite happy to talk stuff up like that, and he will know that the blunt way of putting it is that he has more knowledge of what it takes to win a world championship than Ferrari does. So when he does make recommendations to not just the car feedback, but things like team structure, that matters. That's because he's seeing something in the team that he doesn't think is working as well as when he was at Mercedes and things were just clicking really, really nicely. Think of that absolute peak era Mercedes around sort of 2020, 2021. Even though Lewis lost the Drivers' Championship, they were still operating at a very, very high level. So I think it's just he is doing that, and then he wants to reflect it. I would also just add very quickly, there's something, I've used him as a different example twice now, but Albon said a few times that year out he had, after losing his Red Bull seat was really valuable for him in terms of actually understanding a lot of things mechanically about the car and then being able to be properly involved in development. And the reason that was the case is, as he said, and admittedly his second Red Bull season, the only full one he did was across COVID, so it was a particularly condensed calendar. But he said when you're a driver and you're in the moment, it's actually really hard. You don't have time to go into the real minutiae of like how you'd want the car to be. You're in weekend, you are dealing with the there and now. Like you're just trying to make sure that you have the setup changes you think you might need for the next session, and you'll have the meetings in between. When you go to Maranello or go to your team base or whatever. But even that can be sometimes a little bit like restricted. So if Hamilton feels he's going the extra mile to be like, look, in my own time, I will also think about this. And those things we discussed in that meeting, I've elaborated on them, and here are all of my thoughts. So I think it's just that extra, using that time in between where it does happen, because as Josh pointed out, this was the gap between Silverstone and Belgium. There was an extra week compared to normal. It's not uncommon for there to be a blank week in between races and weekend, but there were two. So it was just a good example of, right, there's a little bit more time than normal, so I'm going to put in a little bit more effort than normal.
And there's an element of him just giving absolutely everything to make this work. He knows it's his last chance. I can't remember who he sat next to in the press conference, but I think it was two rookies, and he said, these guys have got time to win World
Antonelli
Championships.
was one of them.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
And he does have time to win a World Championship. Hamilton doesn't have the time.
He said it's crunch time, didn't he?
And it really is. And I think that's just him saying, look, I am doing absolutely everything every day of the week, every month of this year to make sure that I get that 8th World Championship.
I think it has upset him a little bit, Lewis, that there have been people suggesting that you might just give up and walk away after one season because it's not working. And look, there might genuinely be a bit of just wanting to sort of cover his own backside a little because it's not going quite well on track. So he's trying to go, but look how hard I'm working off track. But I think that would do him a little bit of a disservice. There might be a little bit of that in there because pretty much every F1 driver I've ever met does have ego. We're all guilty of it. So there'll be a little bit of that. But I think he's taken to heart sometimes some suggestions that he's not really up for it. So I think this is his way also of saying, you don't think I'm up for it? I'm working harder than ever.
Let's get on to the final question now that I will take from Simon Ems. This question can be asked two ways, so I will. Was Pirelli justified making the tyre step change at Spa because Norris was much faster in the end, or was Pirelli wrong to make the tyre step choice because Piastri's medium tyre lasted 2/3 of the race distance? Well, it's tricky. There are a number of things going on there because at Spa they found there was a lot less graining than there was the previous year, and that was partly because they've changed the tyres to have less graining. That's one of the things they aim to do. And also the patches of tarmac that they relayed have sort of settled down, so there have been changes in micro and macro roughness. So the way the tyres interacted with the track changed a little bit. They did actually say they felt the C1 was a little bit quicker than they expected in the end. But it's important to remember, Pirelli didn't sort of stick up his hand and say, oh, this will solve all problems in Formula One. It was basically, well, we're willing to do that, have a go, just create some options. And it was a specific experiment on a specific track on a specific weekend. And actually, I would say it created a bit of intrigue in the race, didn't it? Because you did have that question mark of, will Piastri's tyres hang on or will Norris come at him late on? And it wasn't until Piastri picks up the pace, I think it was sort of the penultimate lap and the lap before that, at the end, that you said, oh no, he's got lots in reserve. So I think they're right to try it. They'll have learnt a bit. I wouldn't necessarily say that what happened at Spa will be the typical outcome. And you've got two problems. You've got the risk if you have that step, and certainly if you have the hard, 2 steps harder than anything else, there's a danger it's just too slow to be relevant and it'll be ignored. Or if it goes the other way, you might just find that the soft option just becomes far, far, far too soft as well. So it's really, really difficult. I always say it, covering all eventualities with 6 dry tyre compounds is very difficult. But thank you to everybody who asked a question, and thanks very much to Josh and Scott as well. Remember, if you hang around at the end of this podcast, there is a clip from our exclusive chat about the Hill documentary, a documentary that's well worth watching, and we hope that you enjoy listening to what we have to say about it. But we are here in Budapest. It is the Hungarian Grand Prix, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
But a big part of the story then is going back over Damon's younger years, and I would say life before and after the death of Graham, and it obviously that shapes everything that followed in later years. But Ben, did you think they did a good job of digging into the significant effect of the events of Damon's childhood, and then like his years of adolescence. You know, we all know you've got enough going on in your life, or you feel like you've got enough going on in your life when you're at that age anyway. And then, you know, Damon's life is completely ripped up, and he has to start again. Do they convey that well with how deep they go into this and the footage that they find as well?
Yeah, I think that sort of theme of it being almost part documentary, part home family movie is there throughout. You get clips everywhere interspersed of Damon's later life, family life with his kids and whatnot. There's one of him driving with his son through to Monaco, isn't there, and through Monaco streets. So it's always there. I think in terms of specifically the early part, they don't dwell on it or go into too much detail, but they don't need to, because you get Damon's own commentary and also Georgie's commentary. And some of the stuff that they say, it just whacks you straight away in terms of like crystallising what the whole thing is about, not just the film, but Damon's whole mission, as Ed put it, to race in F1 and win the championship. I think she describes Damon really early on as the saddest person she'd ever met. No, beyond the sort of jokey facade and the stuff he was trying to do on the surface. And Damon also talks quite vividly about the moment he realised his dad had been in the plane crash and conveying that to his mum, and it kind of tearing the family apart. And he crystallises this sense that he missed his dad growing up, but when his dad had been there, the whole family came alive and they didn't see enough of him. He'd lived through one of the most dangerous periods in F1 history, finally stopped racing to focus on running a team, and the family felt like, we've got away with it. He's going to be away a lot, but he's not going to get killed in a racing car. And then it happens in another way. And his mum says something to him like, I knew it was too good to be true. And there's so many of these kind of like gut punches of like sadness and tragedy. Yeah, it really is. But it also sets the whole thing up in terms of really explaining to you right from the off exactly what Damon Hill's whole life from that moment building up to winning the World Championship was about.
And I think what's a great positive is it would be very easy in the hands of slightly less good craftsmanship in the terms of the filmmaking to make this kind of a dual documentary about Graham Hill, about Damon Hill. And although Graham is very much present in this documentary, it's not about Graham Hill. It's about the role Graham Hill plays for Damon, who says he never wanted to be a racing driver. And I think that's really important. And it also very early on introduces the other key narrative thread, which is the relationship with his wife, Georgie Hill, and how grounding she is in it. There's this great bit where she sort of says, and there's just one day Damon just decided he wanted to be Formula One world champion. Said, I'm going to do that. And she's like, all right, go on then. And sort of not because she didn't think it was serious, because she said, I thought he probably would, because he's quite determined. But just sort of her recognition that it was something that Damon had to do. And I think that's really interesting, because the sort of the easy storyline would be, Graham Hill was the world champion, so his son wants to follow in his footsteps. And all the way through, there's the feeling that Damon Hill is almost a reluctant participant in this journey, that he has to do it, which I think is really, really just interesting. He's a very self-aware person, as we've talked about on Bring Back V10s before. He's a very strange psychology for a Formula One world champion. He doesn't fit in a normal box, because he's just a very different character. And I think you watch this and you get the feeling that if what happened to Graham Hill didn't happen, probably Damon Hill would have had a very different life, potentially, because he wouldn't have had that millstone that he felt he had to carry probably until Suzuka 1996. That's certainly, I think, the sort of thesis that is put forward in the documentary.